Students, today I want to talk about historical writing. Now, many of you have been in college now for a little bit, and of course you've taken high school, so you've engaged in some sort of writing that is somewhat at least academic. Historical writing, though, is a bit different. Now, I'm sure you've had to write a history paper or two in your other studies, but in this course, we're going to go over some of the quintessential things that you should be looking at and how you should be structuring papers and setting yourself up for success. We're going to have another overall video that's going to discuss exactly how to use historical formatting, which is Chicago style. But for this portion, we're going to talk about why we write the way we do and what you should be trying to do in order to improve your ability to communicate and to do research. So let's go ahead and get started. Most of you do not have an idea of how to write history. Now, it's nothing against you. I'm not judging anybody here, but you really have not had to sit down and structure multiple historical papers and probably gotten a lot of detailed feedback on what you have been doing, okay? So again, I'm not holding anybody to blame here. It took me a while too when I first started college, and especially my master's program, to understand exactly how to format and create a proper historical paper, the different terms that we should be using, and how to really do the research itself so it makes sense without having to copy off the work of other people. That happens a lot in history, where people find something and they're like, oh, my professor wants me to write on this, I'll just copy what this person has and change the words around a little bit. We're talking about actual research, okay? That's something in history that we engage a lot in, is trying to find different perspectives, different views, and why things actually happen, okay? Now, one of the things that we're going to look at a little bit tighter too is what type of sources are you using? Now, the internet is full of sources. We live in an age where all information of mankind is available online at your fingertips. We really do. Now, does that mean all of it's right or accurate? No. I mean, online we can't trust a good chunk of what's out there, and sometimes what is out there is editable or easily changed or manipulated. So we need to talk about what sources you should be reliant upon, aside from just simply doing a Google search, okay? And lastly, when we are writing history, of course, we're going to be an objective observer of history, which means we are not going to go into a historical study with a built-in bias, because if we do, then our history that we are going to write is not going to be accurate. And it's not going to be academically sound. Meaning, if you were to write an academic paper and get it published, it goes through a review process, and other historians read your work and ensure that it is up to proper standards. If you come in with a highly biased paper, unless the journal itself is biased, you're going to get your paper rejected, and then you're going to have to start over from scratch. And if you're in my class and you submit me a big biased paper, I'm going to note that a lot, and you're probably going to lose a bunch of points, so don't be biased. All right, so what are you looking for when you're picking a historical topic or trying to research something? Well, first and foremost, make sure it's something you're not so passionate about that you're not going to be objective, okay? So if there's something historically that is directly related to your life and that you have deep-rooted feelings in that subject matter already, it may not be the right subject for you. Now, does that mean that disqualify you from writing about that subject? No, not at all. You're just going to have to make extra efforts to pull yourself away from your worldview, which could impact how you write that paper or on that subject, okay? This happens to a number of my students who write on current event topics for their final paper, where they're very passionate about it or something's happened that impacts them directly. And so they put a lot of personal feelings behind the paper that they're writing, okay? Another one is, what kind of value are you offering to the rest of society by writing his paper, all right? Now, what do we mean by value? Well, historians, we try to find something that somebody else hasn't explored or studied or reviewed yet and bring it to light, okay? So, like, one of the things here is I have a couple examples, but Don't just write a very broad paper about, well, what did women in World War II do? And then you just write a very generalized paper on it. If you pull up any history book, or if you do a simple search online, you can find a dozen, if not thousands, of different articles about it. Instead, as a historian, you might want to fill in a little voided spot. So maybe you want to focus in solely on American women that built B-17 bombers and were the ones who created the structural system of those planes. I know that's very specific, but that's what historians now do. We find very narrow sections of history and we add depth and context to it. Because if you instead just have to read about, oh, women in World War II worked in factories, and instead we talk about women played a vital role in the bombings of Germany by building B-17 bombers that were used to fly over there, and that they spent hundreds of hours constructing these, and this is all the research and technology that went into these planes that these women had to put in there. You see, it's much more in depth. People learn a lot more. All right. Originality. This is probably one of the hardest things for historians to deal with, is writing, again, about a subject that has not had a lot of coverage. As I've stated in my other video when we were looking at when you're writing your final paper, do not, under any circumstances, sit there and write me any paper about the entire life of Martin Luther King in 8 pages. Don't do it. You're not going to give me enough information. Instead, focus on a very specific aspect of his life and something that another historian hasn't already written about. So if you're sitting there going, I'm going to write about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., trust me, there's been hundreds of historians that have already well traveled over that ground, and unless you have some radically creative and unique perspective that you can prove, nobody else is going to read another paper on that. All right? Or Cold War. These are all things that you did in high school where your teacher asked you to write about a very generalized topic, and 90% of you turned in a paper about the same person. Okay? We are in college level academic work now. You need to find a topic that is outside of that normal structure and instead really take some time to do some research and some study. All right? This is an important thing for you guys to remember, so remember this. I wrote my master's thesis on Anglo-Spanish trade and diplomacy from 1712 to 1742. When I proposed my topic initially, I was going to write about the War of Jenkins' Ear, and my professor said, oh, there's a couple papers about that already. Maybe find something more unique. And that's when I really focused in on the diplomatic efforts that the British used in trying to gain access to the trading markets of Spain. Not a lot of people had ever studied that. In fact, well, after I did my thesis defense before my board, all of them said to me, none of us knew what you were talking about. We don't have any background in this. And typically, if you're doing a thesis defense, you do it in front of people that are knowledgeable in the subject area. Most of them didn't have much information about this, so it was a very unique, creative topic. All right. Am I writing on that anymore? No, trust me. I never want to read about or write about that ever again. So let's talk about what you should be picking for your historical topic. All right. Overall, you have a research scope. When I was, again, looking at what I wanted to write about, you had to find a very tight time frame into which to do your study and your research. Right now, I'm starting my doctoral thesis, or dissertation, and initially I was starting with a time frame of 1847 to 1877. And as I've gone through my research and looked at what other authors have written, there is about 7 or 8 other books and papers that have tackled that time frame. So now I have to narrow in my thesis and either focus on specific individuals or shorten my time frame. All right. This is very critical and very essential to ensure that you have a quality and in-depth paper instead of a broad paper that covers pretty much nothing but something you could find in an encyclopedia. Okay. One of my ones that I put in here is in Vietnam. Lots of people like to write brief overview of histories of it, but instead, maybe if you were to write about Vietnam, you focus on the development of air cavalry usage. Cavalry has often throughout history been utilized by horsemen who were used as forward screening forces, or by light armor groups. In the Vietnam War, the United States evolved how cavalry was seen and by using helicopters. So this is maybe something somebody would be interested in studying in depth a little more. Now, that particular subject matter, it's been covered. There's a couple books on it, so that might not be a good idea to do. And practicality. Can you actually find information about this? So, I mean, if you want to write a paper about a person or event, is there anything else out there that you could really ever find? Is there actually primary sources that have been written that you can access? Or is there secondary sources that somebody has done other study on that you might be able to pull from? Sometimes topics are so narrow that there's not enough information that you could ever effectively write an actual historical text based around. You might ask me, what might that be? Well, say, for example, you wanted to talk about an ancestor that you personally had that lived in a island nation where there weren't a lot of records, and that a relative didn't keep a diary or a journal, and all you have are second and third hand stories about relatives that may have known them, or maybe a letter or two here. That might be too far away from a subject matter that you would be able to write an actual paper on, okay? I don't discourage you from looking up family history like that, but I do encourage you, if you're writing history, make sure you can find information on it, okay? Let's go ahead and, you guys are going to learn a lot right here. Please, 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 for the love of Pete, do not make these next mistakes. All right. Resources. What are you going to use for research in this course? Now, as a historian, I use a lot of other things, okay? I'll go over those in just a moment. But if you are researching, do not, again, do not, as I say, do not use the following as sources and then cite them in the paper, okay? I will deduct points from you if you use any of these as source material, even in your discussion boards, even in your primary source analysis. Wikipedia, history.com, study.com, Britannica, anything that is an online encyclopedia, virtually every single thing that ends in .com. Now, you can reach out to me, and I would be more than willing to look over the source and make a judgment call as to if it is a verified source that we could actually use. But pretty much any of those, I do not want to see them cited in your papers. And secondly, though, you can use them to start your research. I'm not going to stop you from there, okay? I once had a professor that said that to me. He goes, if you use Wikipedia, I will fail your paper. But it's a great resource to start at and then build from there. All right, so don't use those. What can you use? Well, let's go over a few different sources. Now, I don't expect you to use all of these. They may not all apply to what you're doing. But for example, National World War II Museum.org, great resource if you're going to write any papers on World War II. The Gilder Leham Institute is really good. AmericanHistory.is.edu, very, very solid place to find a lot of information, a lot of primary sources. ProQuest or JSTOR, those are your bread and butter for secondary sources. They are beautiful. I use those probably daily. A lot of the papers and the additional readings that I've assigned to you throughout your course are going to be found in those resources, okay? They are a solid place for secondary resources written by academics that can be trusted, okay? Most other sites, and I can't totally vouch for anything, it's a .org, okay? .orgs are pretty good, but not all of them. But .edu and .gov are usually sources that you don't have to worry about. They're going to be accurate because they need to be accurate, especially government pages. All right, let's talk about sources themselves, because I've mentioned this a few different times and I've alluded to it, so you need to know exactly what I'm talking about. There's two types of sources that we are going to look at that we use when we're historians, all right? The first one is the best one, which is primary sources. If you are a historian, you should be using primary sources in all of your paper, and it probably should be a vast majority of your paper. Primary sources are the following. This is where people get a little bit lost, but let's go ahead and clarify it a little bit. First and foremost, direct evidence of the event. So if you're talking about the event, it needs to be a person that was there when it happened. All right? So direct evidence is somebody who is there when it happened. So these are going to be made up of anything that a person wrote down and imparted to us that we're able to see it today. So this is going to be like their journals, letters, pictures count as primary sources. Material from the event would be so. So for example, when the Berlin Wall fell, they knocked it down with sledgehammers and a few other things, and there's pieces of it that fell off. My parents own a piece of the Berlin Wall. That's a primary source if there was anything written on it. There's not anything written on it really, or some spray paint, but that would be a physical item, okay? Other things might be classical weapons if you're talking about weaponry. Pictures are great though, but at times you may have to put in context that you are looking at. Official government records. I own a number of official government records for papers that I am writing. They can be found online. You can pull up older ones. What I'm writing about right now, I have a big blue book right there in the middle. It's about this thick. It's all the communications between the United States government, pretty much anything that relates to the territory of Utah during the Civil War. So I constantly have to kind of pour through that and find letters and use them. Okay, so if they were there and they saw it and they wrote down their account, this is a primary source. So remember that. Okay. Now secondary sources we still use a lot of. Often a secondary source is going to pull using primary sources in their paper. A secondary source is, of course, going to be like a newspaper report. Now, I know many of you are going to be like, newspaper report, shouldn't that be a primary source? It can be if the reporter was there and saw it directly, okay? Often, though, what we get with newspaper reports, especially older ones, is another person saw it, told the newspaper reporter what they saw. That doesn't count as a primary source because the person who then wrote it down did not see the event directly. They're taking the words of somebody else that saw and witnessed the event. A biography. So biographies, if you find an autobiography, it's a primary source. That is the person who witnessed the event and was there, wrote it down, and that is their recollection. Even if it's done 20 years later, that is still a primary source. If you have a historian who wrote a biography about Ulysses S. Grant, that is not a primary source. He probably used a lot of primary sources to write that, but the book itself is not a primary source, okay? A lot of the papers you're going to run into in academic journals like the JSTOR, that is all going to be a secondary source, okay? Again, built off of primary sources. Almost any textbook that you use is going to be a secondary source, and again, anything that has been interpreted from a primary source is now going to fall into secondary sources. You're going to use both of these, okay? On your paper, I expect to have you use 3 primary sources at minimum and 3 secondary sources at minimum. You should be pulling sources. You guys should pick out your topic early so you can start locating good sources on these, okay? I don't expect you guys to visit archives. It's just not that time frame in your life yet, okay? All right. Other things to understand about a primary source is look over this information, okay? Who created it? What was their motivation? What do you know about this person? What different things might impact their point of view? So, for example, if you're studying the Great Awakening and you're getting a detailed account about George Whitefield appearing in a camp meeting and how some people report, I felt this amazing wealth of the Spirit pour over my soul and I was instantly transformed into a new man and I accepted, the Lord into my life. Is that an unbiased observer? What was his motivation for writing that? He might be saving it for his own personal spiritual relationship. Now, say, for example, you had somebody who was sitting over in the corner watching the same event, and he was a newspaper reporter, and he simply documented what he saw, what Whitefield said, how the actions of other people were. Okay? That's how you can look at different aspects of who they are. Same thing as if you're looking over maybe a letter. Early on, American revolutionaries, who they're writing to, what the purposes of their letter were, when they called King George III a nutcase, that might be indicative as who the political beliefs they have is, okay? Also, you need to evaluate the primary sources to the overall audience. Was it meant to be personal in nature? So that might be letters. Might it be openly distributed for public use? These might be like a pamphlet that somebody wrote. Also, when you're using a primary source, it needs to justify its use in your paper, okay? For example, if you're making a claim or a statement about something that happened, then you need that primary source. If you're just throwing it in there because Professor Lajeunesse expects you to have a primary source, that's not what you use a primary source for, okay? And I'll pretty much understand that that's what you're doing, so don't do it. But utilize primary sources to the best of your ability. All right, secondary sources. Once again, these are really brief overviews of secondary sources. Why is it written? Who was it written by? When was it written? That is very important. When we look over secondary sources, the understanding or the research may have been broadened over time. So, for example, I wrote a paper recently on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and I utilized sources that started in 1870, and they went all the way up to 2018, okay? Multiple narratives of the events changed. People's roles changed. Who was there changed. What their motivations were changed as more primary source documents became more and more available. You had a definitive book. It was written in 1954, which was considered the end-all, be-all for the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and then a new group of historians who had access to records that nobody had seen before wrote a new book that changed the whole narrative, okay? That's why you need to know time frame, because something may have changed because of access to new documents, okay? Look at the sources. Make sure they're valid sources. If they are not, do not trust it. So if somebody is using hearsay evidence to justify the structure and the evidence in their paper, that's not a trustworthy secondary source, okay? Also, make sure that their thesis is accurate too. Make sure it's an unbiased thesis. That is troublesome. So again, reading about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, I read one book who made all sorts of claims, and they were using hearsay evidence for a vast majority of their claims. It wasn't a reliable book, and obviously the author had a particular anti-religious bent to it. So there was a reason for him writing the book the way he wrote it, okay? All right. So, how do you write an awesome paper? Well, first thing, your paper should present an argument, a point of view, critical judgment of your own, and it ought not be a formless pile of facts or disconnected topic analysis. What do I mean? Make it make sense. I mean, don't just throw a bunch of facts, blend them all up, and dump them onto a paper and be like, look, I wrote a paper for you. Don't do that. It needs to be focused. It needs to actually have a reason for existing, okay? Be very specific as to what your goals are for the paper. What questions are you answering that you are trying to accomplish here? What is your reason for writing this paper? What information are you presenting them, okay? Now, more than anything else, you need to have a thesis that works. That is something we miss a lot, and that's why I have a thesis check assignment in this course, so that you can get your thesis approved, so you know that it's going to be something you could structure an entire paper off of. If not, I will provide you feedback, and I will let you know what you should probably narrow it down to or how you can focus it more, okay? Your thesis is, of course, always going to be found at the front of your paper. Your conclusion at the end of the paper should match your thesis, which means as you're researching your thesis change and you write a new conclusion, change your thesis to match that conclusion, all right? And again, that goes on to this very end piece. Your thesis might change based upon the research. You might have a question, you might go into it and be like, this is exactly what happened, and this is what I'm going to find information about, and everything you look at contradicts everything you thought possible before on the subject matter, so you have to change everything and start over. It happens, okay? Don't feel bad. It happens to all of us. Happened to me, all right? Okay. Do not go in with a fixed narrative or hypothesis. Again, that's what I just said. Don't go in there with your bias and be like, I'm going to justify this event because I feel this way and these people were terrible and therefore they're all awful and I'm going to write this paper about how awful they all are. Don't do that. That's going to be very obvious at the beginning of how you use your language and everything else throughout the rest of the paper, okay? And again, there needs to be a reason for it, and it needs to have a justification to exist. I know some of you will get mad at me because you might be a journalist major, but if you want to write stories and things that are non-objective and made-up facts and stuff like that, then go be a journalist. I don't mean all journalists are like that, but some journalists are. I mean, on all spectrum. There's journalists that are dishonest, and it's been since the beginning of time. This is not a new thing, okay? So again, if you are a journalism student, just go out and be a great reporter, and I will love you forever because I'm always seeking unbiased news sources, okay? All right, don't cherry pick your evidence, which means if you find something that counteracts what your argument is, you go, ooh, let's just bury that in the corner, and we'll never see that again and pretend it never existed. That is not how you research. You need to take that into account, and if you are going to exclude it, you need to say why you excluded it. All right? So if it's something counter to what you believe or what your thesis was based around, and it's just not comfortable to add, then get rid of it. Have it go away. But tell people why you put it away. Okay? You have to justify it. If it counters your thesis and it counters your argument, you have to say why you excluded it. It has to have a reason. If it's unreliable, that would be your reason. But you need to explain why, because other researchers are going to find it. And then they're going to look at your paper and be like, this person totally ignored this piece of evidence. And then they're going to say your entire paper is invalid because you ignored that piece of research. Also, multiple perspectives. Do not write it from one person's perspective or one specific perspective. Now, this is not to be political, okay? I'm just going to demonstrate something to you of how you write a paper that only has one viewpoint. So, for example, I had a student last term who wrote a paper about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood. All of her sources were from Margaret Sanger's library and from Planned Parenthood and any other pro-abortion group. None of it came from any other source. Did that mean that she used a variety of sources to look into Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood? She did not. She just picked one source or one group of sources that would justify their viewpoint in their paper and push that forward. You need to have a couple contradicting sources in there that would say something different or provide an additional perspective, okay? Again, this is not a political judgment on this paper. It was more just, this is what it would look like if you made this type of paper, okay? If you use one perspective, I will dock you point. I will dock you points from your grade, and I will notate at the very bottom, this is why I did it. Have a variety of sources, okay? Lastly, what is the goal of your research? What are you really trying to do? Well, first off, you're going to try to persuade people that your thesis is right comparative to other people's thesis. This happens in history all the time. Somebody will come to a conclusion, somebody will disagree with that conclusion, and they will write a differing paper and tell you all the things that the other person got wrong. And then they'll justify it with their new set of facts and opinion and research. Well, not opinion, get rid of opinion and research. Okay? So you have to be able to justify it. But if you are biased and your sources are narrowly focused and only using one perspective, everybody else will look at your work and laugh it off and throw it in the trash. Okay? Don't be that person. Be an honest, objective observer of history and utilize all the resources that are out there for you. Okay? Last few things I need to really talk about. All right, first and foremost, this is very important. Very, very, very important, and you need to know this. Do not plagiarize. Okay? What is plagiarism? I'm just going to read it out to you. Plagiarism is the appropriation and imitation of the language or ideas of another, representing them as one's original thoughts. This includes paraphrasing, because people do this all the time, which means you take what you just read and you just jumble the words a little bit around, and now you say it's your own idea. It is not your own idea. You just stole somebody else's idea and jumbled the words around a little bit. I will know when that happens. Trust me, it's easy to tell when somebody has decided just to go to the thesaurus and start changing some words here and there. All right? Don't do it. how do you know if you're plagiarizing? Well, these are key things to understand first and foremost. You don't cite the source from what the material was directly or indirectly taken from, meaning you read a secondary source or an internet article or a web page and you just took that information and dumped it in your paper and you're like, this is mine, and you run with it. No, you can use other people's stuff. You just have to cite it. Say, I got it from here. Okay? That is 100% okay. Do that. I'm not going to get mad at you for doing that, but don't do like entire paragraphs, then we're going to have a problem. But you give them the credit for what work they did and just cite it in there. You can use it, okay? How do you tell if you're doing that or not? If you use more than 2 words in successions from another author without putting the phrase in quotation marks, you are plagiarizing, okay? You go past 2 words. So if you said, the Berlin Wall was, and then you write a whole sentence about that, you've already hit the plagiarism point, was at that after that. No, I'm kidding. It's not that. You can't really do that. That's a bit too narrow. But if it's somebody else's research and you're pulling from it and you're exactly taking chunks from it, be aware of that, okay? What is not plagiarism? This is a little bit more where people kind of get lost. But first and foremost, common historical knowledge. What do I mean by that? Well, I can tell you that Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor and bombed the naval base there. That is a known, easy to know historical fact that most people know, okay? That means it's common knowledge and you can put that into your paper. Also, if you are analyzing something, if you are pulling from a source and you're reviewing it and you're putting your own words about what you understood from the paper, that is not plagiarism. All right, so those are things that you needed to know. Lastly, you need to know what the penalties are for plagiarism in my class. I know they're not going to be pleasant, so don't do them. First and foremost, if I catch you doing plagiarism on any of your assignments, it's instant 0 for that assignment. There's no mercy, sorry. And you don't get to redo it. It's just a 0. All right? Secondly, it's a 0 on the assignment, and then I report it to the academic integrity department, okay? That goes onto your permanent record. Don't have that happen, because when you leave Valencia and you need to go to UCF, all that information follows you. All right? So don't plagiarize, because people will find out that you have done this, okay? And then if you've done it in multiple classes, then it's going to show up in multiple places. All right, lastly, if I catch you doing it a 3rd time, you will fail my course completely. I will give you a 0. Sorry. Just don't do it. All right, is plagiarism hard for me to see? Nope. Because most of you are just lazy when it comes down to it. I'm not claiming any of you do, but some of your peers have been lazy in the past. Let me put it that way, okay? Where they've literally just taken somebody, copied it from the internet, and dumped it in there, and it doesn't fit into any other part of their paper. Like you're suddenly going, wait a minute, this writing style has changed completely. And then I do a quick search on it through our plagiarism checking tools, and I'm like, oh, there it is. Boom. And then I will copy and paste it into my remarks and say, hey, look what I found. Yeah, don't be that person, okay? Please, 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 please. If you're doing a discussion board or a video post and you are copying, pasting, it's pretty obvious when I've read discussion board, the 4th discussion board on the same subject, and the words are exactly the same as the 3 previous ones. Trust me, don't do it anymore. Save me, please. Save me. Because I'm going to find out, okay? And lastly, I can gauge people's writing styles pretty quick, understand your level and competency in writing and how you structure your sentences. And if it doesn't sound like you, I will know it doesn't sound like you. It's just something I can do. All right, I know this has been really long. I'm sorry, guys. Let's wrap it all up. If you do this, your papers will be awesome if you follow everything that I said in here. You're going to do great. You're going to have awesome papers. I'm going to be so happy. I'll be proud of you, and I'll put smiley faces on things, and I will tell you how awesome of a student you are. If you don't do any of this, you're going to have awful papers, and I'm going to be miserable reading them, and I'm going to be very sad because I gave you all these options to make you better. Don't make me sad. Make me happy, please. One big thing is I've let you know at the beginning of this term how you can set up and prepare for your paper. This is not some mystery that you're going to try to figure out in the last 3 weeks of class. You have the entire term to write this paper. Use that time, okay? Start it early, prepare early, get your sources in place, and then if you write a page every 2 weeks, you're pretty much going to be right near where you need to be at, okay? And you're going to have a well thought out, well constructed, and good looking paper. And lastly, review over it. Have somebody else read your paper. I even do this, okay? I have a friend of mine, she's an English major. She reviewed over my entire 118-page master's thesis for me to check for the errors that I had, of course, missed. You're going to miss them. Even if it's a 6 to 8 page paper, your mind eventually is like, I've written this, I've looked it over 7 times, and I know that there's no spelling errors. Trust me, there's spelling errors, okay? Just have somebody do a quick review for you. It's not going to hurt. All right, I look forward to reading your guys' papers, and hopefully this has helped out. And I will see you guys a little bit later.